Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So today, Mala not able to make it, as you can see, but we do have Mike. How you doing, Mike?
Very well, thanks. Hope you are, Kevin.
So the way Shop Talk works, it's a chat-driven show. Usually, we find a way to get chat to get me riled up on a rant somehow, and I'm looking forward to seeing where we end up ranting tonight. Uh, if you do have questions, I mean, the whole nature of Shop Talk is a little bit of water cooler discussion after the workday. If you've got technical questions, especially in the data platform world, drop them in chat. We'll talk about them. I've got a couple of topics for tonight, but tonight is going to be a chat heavy night, I think. So I'm not saying that it's all on you, chat, but it's mostly on you. So let us start with the first topic. So this came in via email. Came in from one of the many excellent marks in the community. And it involves quota delimiters and CSVs. So before I get to that topic, I do have one announcement. Mala couldn't be here tonight, but she did want to talk about WIP Beginner Data Science Day. So I'm dropping a link in the chat there. That is a full day event taking place. I got to check the date. It is on August 20th, so that's just a few days away. That is this Friday, amazingly enough. And runs full day Eastern time. Check it out. And registration is at the link provided. So now, let's talk quota delimiters, and specifically how a lot of the products around SQL Server do a horrible job with quota delimiters. Make it simple. You have a delimited file. Maybe it's a comma separated values file. So I have values that are separated by commas. Cat, comma, dog. Everybody's happy. At least everybody's happy until someone says, but wait, in one of my fields, I want to have a comma. And then you say, well, you can't have commas because that's the separator value. But after a lot of arguing, PM says, nope, we have to have commas. So you have a couple options. I mean, one option is you can change the delimiter to something that's not incredibly common. But the problem with that is you'll find all kinds of weird characters. I mean, we've got Mike in chat here, or different Mike in chat, not that Mike, but Mike in chat talking about Cyrillic characters. You'll see all kinds of weird characters in natural data sets. And not the type of thing that you'll necessarily be able to find easily. This character does not appear at all in the data itself. And yeah, Solomon, quoted identifiers. Yes, I'm talking quoted identifiers or text delimiters, depending on what you're talking about. So I decided I would smash them together and call them quoted delimiters, just because if Microsoft's going to be wrong, I'm going to be wrong too. That's my justification. But let's kind of take it back a little bit. So we have these separator, like a comma, and I've decided that I would like to use this within my field while still having the separator remain a comma. No problem. No problem, developer said. What we'll do is we'll have some identifier that says this marks the contents of a field. And any delimiters within that are actually not delimiters. They're non-delimiters. So a comma there is just a comma. It's not a separator. The problem is that in a lot of circumstances, different tools will treat that quite differently. So if I have quotation marks cat comma dog surrounded in quotation marks, what I would expect from a parser is that cat comma dog, the contents of the field, would be propagated. What often happens is that one of like 3 or 4 different things, depending on which parser you're using. And this is where things get to be fun. So for example, with Polybase, one of my constant critiques with Polybase is they have a quoted identifier. So you can use quotation marks to identify a field, and the parser will very happily for you take those quoted identifiers away and then parse the record as though it didn't exist. That's not the behavior that I wanted at all. In fact, that's the whole reason to have the quotation marks in there, is to allow for a separator value, a non-delimiting delimiter to exist in there. And that doesn't work the way that you would hope. In other cases, the quotation marks have been added, how would we say, prophylactically, just in case. You know, we have quotation marks around every string value. And in that case, this is where SQL Server's text delimiter comes into play, where you can say, use the quotation mark there and basically take them away, sort of like the quoted identifier in Polybase. Just take those away, but still parse the value the same. So in other words, again, we're kind of avoiding the problem that this thing is intended to solve, and simply dealing with the effect of, I have a quoted identifier or a text delimiter here that is intended to delimit the scope of a value. Then you have the next problem where if we use quotation marks as that text delimiter or that quoted identifier, quotation marks tend to be pretty commonly used in descriptive text. And this is where chat's going here with this, like embedded delimiters are supposed to be doubled to be escaped as per the RFC. Embedded text qualifiers, yeah, embedded delimiters aren't supposed to be treated any differently. So this is where I'm saying, if you have a quotation mark inside of your field, which just happens to be delimited with quotation marks, you are supposed to use double to indicate that this is really just a single quotation mark, which, yeah, okay. But then, as Mike points out, there is more than one RFC for this. And my recollection is at least one of the others actually uses backslashes, where you preface this with a backslash before your text delimiter to indicate that this is not really a delimiter, this is actually just a regular character. And the upshot of all of this is it's all going to depend on your parser anyhow, because a lot of parsers will take the same input file and treat it quite differently, to the point of where something that may work in one parser for one system might not work in a different parser for a different system. If you're pulling data, for example, from MySQL and exporting it as text, and you use the parser from there, and then you import it using SSIS and its flat file importer, that structure between the two files might be a little bit different in terms of expectations. So what types of text delimiters you have, how things are identified separately, and whether or not the separator value, that delimiter, being embedded within a field and not intending to delimit a value, is interpreted as just another character. And kind of makes you want to go back to the day of fixed width files until you remember just how bad fixed width files are, because those were pretty bad as well. Those are really bad for space utilization and for things where, yeah, I can have varied width. I may have a description field here, which can be up to infinite characters. Like, I don't know how big this thing can be. It can be really big, and I don't necessarily want to limit it to, well, the developer said 255 because 255 sounds like a magic number. It's a really good number, so it seems like a good length for a description, which ends up being a lot of where numbers come in for maximum lengths for different types of files and fields within files. ASN1 or BER/DER. I don't even know what those mean. Don't even know. So I think I have that going for me. So Mike, you got me stumped on that one. Certs and crypto. Okay. Yes. I will embrace the power of and say, yeah, sure. Okay, PKI, public key infrastructure. Okay. All right, so let's see. Solomon, who I would, let's see. Solomon says embedded delimiters. So embedded text qualifiers are to be doubled to be escaped. Embedded delimiters are fine, as is due to be text qualified, assuming that your parser understands that the text qualifier is supposed to qualify the text, which, like I mentioned, polybase, no. That quoted identifier is just a road bump to be removed, and then we parse the file after that. I mean, it's insane how wrong that behavior is. But getting into the weeds, basically, I guess what I would say is when you're dealing with delimited files, especially if you have a fairly common delimiter or a delimiter which can show up within your text itself, it's worth doing some significant testing. Try a lot of different types of input data sets. Just make sure you understand how your parser works, because if you move to a different system, that parser may behave differently. As an alternative, using a file format which is not a separated value style, probably going to be better off for it. So, for example, I think this is one of 3 or 4 reasons why Parquet has become such a popular file format. Because so reasons not related to this, compresses extremely well due to its columnar nature, which means that it's great for getting a huge amount of fact-style data in a relatively small file. B, it includes metadata about the columns, which means that you can actually parse the metadata without reading the files itself and get enough information that you might be able to solve some problems just by looking at that metadata. But C, because you don't have to worry about, well, what happens if there's a comma inside one of the fields? Doesn't matter. It's not actually stored as a separated values data set. So we don't have to worry about how am I going to parse this. The parsing is already handled within the format. Solomon says XML would be good. I mean, this is actually one of the reasons why XML was created as an electronic data interchange, because of all of the problems with separated values. But then XML has its own problems of being verbose, of XSLTs being the type of thing that would make you want to gouge your eyes out in order to avoid dealing with them ever again. And being a little complex for the nature of some problems. Also, people can use ASCII 30 and 31, which are the decimal values, as those should be record separator and unit separator and exist for this purpose. Those shouldn't be in normal data. I would agree with you that probably is not going to show up very often in normal data. and that is the intended separator. It does get tricky because my recollection is that most text editors don't understand ASCII 30 and ASCII 31. So there's no nice visual indicator of a separation. And if you're working with a text editor that doesn't understand those particular characters, you may see that there is no separator because, well, I'm not visually seeing it, and that may be an indication to you that, oh, there's a problem with this file. Also painful when you're dealing with trying to human parse, like eyeball parse a problem with a file and try to understand what's going on here. Why is this not loading the way I expect it to? Because I'm not able to see the separator. Versus a comma or a pipe or a semicolon, which, has the major problems that those are very common delimiter or very common characters in files, and so aren't great delimiters, but at least your text editor can see them. More appropriate tools. Use more appropriate tools. I mean, use better tools, I think, is a fair statement, but I'm not sure of that many text editors that actively show like ASCII character 30 or 31. I don't recall. I mean, it could be that I'm just not recalling it, and a lot of them do, but I don't know of too many off the top of my head which really understand it. And I mean, it's funny because that is, as you're saying, it's exactly right. That is why those two characters on the ASCII set exist, in order to separate rows and units. And to try to solve this problem, so regular identifiers or quoted identifiers are incorrect terms here. The discussion has nothing to do with identifiers. And yet, Polybase calls it the quoted identifier. SQL Server calls them quoted identifiers, except when they call them text delimiters. So that's terminology which I am using here because it is used in common parlance in the data platform space. Though I will accept that there is no identifier. There's no identification of a thing here. But that is the term that's used for a text delimiter, at least in Polybase. Those usages are just wrong. I expect that you will send a strongly worded letter to Microsoft about this, Solomon. In fact, I think I demand it now. I'm looking forward to your strongly worded letter. Our Microsoft says XML is not for humans. That is true. I've come to the conclusion that nothing is for humans. That's my hot take of the day. Nothing is for humans. We can't have nice things. This is why we can't have nice things. We start creating languages and end up with horrible ambiguities. We create numbers and end up with irrationality. Just a whole lot of problems. Don't even get me started on dates and times. Don't even get me started. Or just update the doc. Well, it's in the T-SQL itself. So the parameter is actually called quoted underscore identifier. You'd have to do a little bit more than just updating Microsoft Docs. Unless you would say, quoted identifier, not really a quoted identifier. This is actually a text delimiter, but somebody said the wrong thing. To your point, humans created the job control language, so that's evidence in your favor. Yeah. Although, Mike, I think in chat, I think you would probably like JCL more than most of us. You may. Hey, ancient Greeks killed the guy who first proffered the idea that 1 divided by 2 could be irrational. There's also a King Solomon joke in there. 1 divided into 2. but we're not going to go there. This is a classy channel. This is a classy shop talk most of the time. Oh, Mike, you're on mute.
Well, if you cut them into two, you'd have to do it with a comma or a backslash.
So that was a little rant on quota delimiters. It was a little rant. Didn't get too hot under the collar for that one, except that it is really annoying with polybase. I mean, that's something that had bothered me for so long that I'm not even able to get angry about it anymore. I just get frustrated that it's never going to be fixed, probably. But we'll see. Maybe it will. Maybe it will. The square root of 2. Okay, yeah, 1 divided by the square root of 2. All right. Yeah. Could be irrational. True. And I was also thinking of polybase implementation is just wrong, sad to say. I mean, yes, for delimited files, yeah, the implementation there is very much lacking, and I'd love to see them fix it. My expectation is they probably won't, but my expectation could be wrong. Who knows? Who knows? 1's divided by the square root of 2. So ancient Greeks killed the guy who came up with that idea that it could be irrational. On net, it was probably still a wise choice. I don't know that I would trust that guy. I mean, dividing by the square root of 2, that doesn't seem like the type of thing that people should try. Does not seem right. It might corrupt the children like Socrates did. Speaking of Bill and Ted, so our next thing, there was an interesting email that I got from Bob. Error when running, so he was trying to run DBCC reindex to rebuild an index that had always encrypted enabled. So you've got a table, always encrypted on one column, and built an index, which includes that column. Ended up getting a weird error with basically saying that, hey, this in varchar max column that has deterministic encryption on it is incompatible with the varchar data type. And so DBCC poked out that error message and gave up, essentially. The solution that Bob came up with, fortunately, Bob came up with a solution quickly. The solution there was to drop auto-generated statistics for the table, which, considering that wasn't at all in the error message, it took a little while to try to figure out what was going on there. But apparently dropping auto-generated stats, then trying to rebuild the index actually did work. Now, I'm curious there if that was going to happen as well if he used alter index rebuild, or if it was just a DBCC reindex thing, where I'm not sure if the actual code underneath both of those operations is the same. That would be interesting. Oh yeah, Red Nelly. Okay, so you're in chat. Excellent. Right after you wrote, yeah, glad you're able to find it so quickly. Tried alter index. Okay, so alter index also failed. All right, so I guess it is probably calling the same code under the covers for both, which if ever I popped a debugger up and ran, I could probably figure it out, but that would involve running a debugger, and usually when I run a debugger, I find bugs. Generally, that's on my own code, but I don't. That's why I don't run a debugger. If I don't run the debugger, I don't have the bugs. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. But good news is, after deleting those auto-generated stats, no problems anymore. So life is good. Based on the error message, maybe there was something around where one of the auto-generated stats was created before encryption, or something just got out of line. Anyhow, if you do run into that problem, maybe that'll work. Drop stats, and perhaps it'll solve your problem. So Enhanced QC says, if I bust out the debugger, there should be some dollars floating from the ceiling, right? Maybe. Although I could have, this actually does give me a business idea, not debugging as a service, where for a limited amount of money per month, I will promise never to debug your code. And that way, all the issues that I would introduce by testing your code or debugging your code would go away. Incidentally, way back when, I was a tester, and I was really good at finding bugs in code. Not just my own, mind you, other people's code as well. So not debugging as a service seems like a winning option for me. That's real regression testing. No bugs at all. Yep, exactly. And your code will regress to prior states. So, I mean, it's regression right there. I guess technically regression testing is to prevent that, but semantics. So, Mike says, not finding bugs is not a way to eliminate them. Yes, but it is a way to not eliminate them.
That's why when I started learning JavaScript, I was like, oh gosh, there's so many pitfalls here. Make so many mistakes. Not even know that they're there.
I told those who use my code to always report problems to me. Yeah, in reality, you know, taking tongue out of cheek. Yes, I think this is something as developers, at least I've not always been great about it. I've tried to be good about it, but treating bug reports as an opportunity to fix a problem in code, and as opposed to a bug report as preventing me from doing something that I want to do, or proof that I've done wrong. So, in other words, something that I want to cover up and hide as opposed to expose and fix. That's not a great attitude to have. I've had the attitude. I've been combative in bug reports. I mean, sometimes the problem is that the bug report is the thing is broken. And this is where going back to being a good tester. Part of being a good tester is having some methodical approach where you're able to do A, B, C, to remember what you have done, and then to be able to understand like what the ramifications are of what you're doing, leading to this negative result. So, as a tester, you'll want to first start here with this data, enter these data points. Okay, then go to here, then go to here, and then you come back and those data points have changed. And I didn't expect those to change. In fact, I expected them to be the same because A, B, and C. That is the type of report that, you know, as a developer, I really would prefer to get over the thing is broken. But having that level of clarity, and also not necessarily assuming what the answer is. It is a trap that I can fall into as a QA person or as a tester, or when I'm trying out somebody else's code. Hey, I did this thing, and I'm pretty sure that you have a problem here. And the answer may not actually be there. It may be some automated job which is running that just happens to corrupt this data. It may not be related to the component that you're thinking of at all. And so that's where being clear on here were the steps and also trying to reproduce, that's why that's so critical. So Mike says there are, of course, a minimum number of bugs which tests must get to quickly so that the product can ship on time. Um, yes, and as a developer, I try to make sure to put in at least a minimum number of bugs. That way I can ship my code. So, once I get to like 300 bugs, then I'm good. Now this is shippable. Regression works at least the same as it used to work. Oh, so I've actually had cases where I've had to deal with reporting in which I need to be able to replicate the old code, except that the old code did it wrong. So prior to this date, we have to show the old results, even though everybody recognizes that they were wrong, but this is what we reported to agencies, and therefore that number has to stay. We can't have that number change after the fact because then bad things happen to us. So we put a little note in one of our reporting documents that, by the way, these numbers were wrong for these years. And then going forward, you have the new calculation. Or you say, we've changed the way the calculation works, and now here's the new calculation. But that all those old ones have to stay the same. That can lead to some expensive code in terms of number of lines of code and mental complexity in figuring out what's going on. Because do this if the date is before this point, or if these circumstances, it was for these pre-created reports, and then do it for differently for everything else. Auditing file changes. Red Nello's got a question. We were hacked a couple of months ago, and they changed web config files by removing a character, a work in a path, or a word in a path, I guess. Telerik exploit, so it's really hard to spot. We closed the door since then, but want to know if anybody knows of a tool that will alert you of files changing on the server. There are a fair number of products that will track that. I'm trying to think if I know of any off the top of my head. I'm not sure, but there definitely are products that will track changes, and you can specify folders, you can specify particular files, things that you wouldn't expect to change very frequently. File integrity monitoring can be done for free or with expensive SIM suites. Thanks, Enhanced QC, you're for filling in on that detail. But yeah, there definitely are tools available, and like Enhanced QC says, it's a hash. Yeah, essentially you're building a hash and comparing it to what you expected to see there, and you can have whitelisted directories or whitelisted files where I expect this to change frequently. Don't even worry about calculating that. And others where, okay, like the web.config, it may change once a year when we add a new connection string. But in that case, I still want to see an alert. And especially for something like a web config or a machine.config, where that's not the type of thing I would expect to change very frequently. And where the ramifications, as you saw, were pretty significant. That would be a file to watch. And I think there is even stuff built into Windows that will allow for some of the work, but definitely check into it. It is hash-based comparisons. I mean, frankly, you could even do it yourself if you really wanted to for important files and directories.
And can I ask, is that like it's creating a key based on like the name of the file or something?
Yeah, basically
hashing it.
So think of the key would be the location of the file, the full path of the file, and then the value would be a hash of whatever contents are in there, whatever binary or text contents are in that file. So
that would make it digest. It would get an integer.
Yeah, so you might run it through like SHA-256, and now you have a 256-bit digest of the contents of that file. So it could be a 4 gig file, but you're creating a 256 bit in output, and that's what you're storing. And then next time you run, you see, okay, does this match up to what I expected it to match up to before? Not the type of thing you might do very often on giant files like what I mentioned, but it's something that we've used for a long time for things like, are the files in this Linux distribution, in fact, the same files that I expected them to be? Where they would create MD5 hashes, and you would check the checksums there and make sure that all of these files match the checksums that I have computed previously to ensure that nobody has tried to sneak in some malicious code. SE Linux, SE Linux does that pretty well. And I'm almost positive that there's something somewhere in the Windows world built into Windows that does enough similarly that you could create a solution or find a tool which does it for you, and emphasize the directories that are going to be most likely to be dangerous, as opposed to like C Windows. Although that actually may be a place to check. You'll get a lot of alerts on update day, but I mean, that's not too bad. At the very least, you'll see when those servers get patched, because you'll get a whole slew of updates. I would not have them email you individually, but getting a report of things that have changed, and especially focusing on some of the more important directories, maybe directories where you have code stored, where you have config files stored, where you have some of the most important files, but not necessarily giant data sets. So not your SQL Server, MDF, and LDFs. Those things would change very frequently, so I wouldn't even try to do anything with them. Salamar says, not long ago I learned how to create a security log for table changes. Is that something that could be altered to trigger an alert? Yeah, if you're tracking, for example, changes to tables, if I have an insert, update, or delete, and maybe I have a trigger that writes to an audit table, or if I have another method of tracking changes, I'm just using a trigger as the simplest one to implement. You could definitely tie that into alerting, where on insert into your alert table, it could send an email, or it could page an operator. Those alerts are built into the SQL agent, and those operations can be automated. So short answer is yes. Like if you have a reference table that you expect not to change, you might put a trigger on there. So an insert or an update operation or delete operation which changes this reference table that you don't want to change, you don't want updated, inserts a record into an audit table and sends an email. That is it's a poor man's solution. There are tools that exist which will perform more appropriate auditing. So this is not the type of thing that, for example, if you have auditors who need to ensure that this data never changes, that might or might not fly given who your auditor is and how savvy they are. If you're looking for something that is a little more audit friendly, like if you have to think about legal consequences of updating this data, where there may be a lawsuit involved, then that's where SQL Server Audit comes into play. And those audit files are going to be a little bit more sturdy in terms of tracking changes, but alerting off of those audit files is something that you would have to either buy a third-party tool to read the audit files and contact you, or to write your own, which is not trivial. Idera at one point had a tool, I think it was SQL Secure, where they would read your audit files and they would be able to track operations that occurred. And that kind of fits in with some of what you were talking about, Salamar. But, like I said, if you just want something where it's not legally actionable, where instead it's more, I just want to make sure that nothing goofy is happening in this system, then you might have a trigger on those tables on insert, update, delete, which also inserts into some log table, which it sounds like you've already got. And then you can put an alert on changes on your audit table. So Enhanced QC is talking about systemd and init are key areas in Linux as an example of places where you'd never want, or where you want to audit any sort of change. Yeah, absolutely. And isn't FileMon from sysinternal still around? You're right, Mike. It is Process Monitor now. It's Procmon. $100 says Microsoft bought it by now. Technically, they bought the creator as opposed to the suite. So sysinternal's Mark Rusinovich became a Microsoft employee after writing a bunch of sysinternal's tools and brought them with him to Microsoft. So they are officially supported by Microsoft. They're officially released by Microsoft, but it was because they bought him as opposed to buying his software suite. MD5 hash is the only hash that is adjudicated, by the way. SHA-256 or others help. However, MD5 is the only authenticated evidence allowed as of right now. Considering the number of collisions with MD5, that is interesting. And I guess you're meaning perhaps with when it comes to legal terms, like if you were in some sort of forensic analysis for law, or so Mike says no, not true, but I'm not sure about what he's disagreeing. We have an objection. So Mike, what's your objection? Where we get to the exciting part. Oh, for forensics, they use MD5 and SHA. Okay. I kind of thought so because, like I said, MD5 at this point, there are enough places where a collision can happen that I would be surprised if that was the only thing that could be used in in a forensic audit. Learn from Dr. Cole at SANS training. MD5 evidence is allowed. SHA is allowed, but not authoritative. Forensics and authenticated evidence are two different things. Okay. That is a gap in my knowledge with authenticated evidence. I'm not... I don't even pretend to be a lawyer. So I got that going for me. Nor do I pretend to be a legal expert, especially when it comes to, well, anything. I don't pretend to be a legal expert at all. So I could put that on my business card. Not a legal expert, and also offer non-testing as a service. So this has been the episode where I'm forced to admit all of the things I don't know. So well done, chat.
It's like Mark Twain writing all the things he didn't die of.
Yeah, your interrogation techniques are working so far. Not in law, but listen to those doing forensic evidence to lawyers. Yeah, I've done some coursework in the forensics world, but this was 8 years ago, thereabout. So I'm not up to speed on anything near the latest around that. And even then, the coursework was mostly, here is how this happens, as opposed to anything regarding like once you start talking to the lawyers, the types of terminology you need to use and the legal processes involved. It was more of, here are some of the tools that are used for this, for forensics, and not so much on the what you do when you find that there's a problem side of things. So huge gap in my knowledge on that front there. Forensics is anything useful to piece together a picture. Evidence in court has to be authenticated. The courts are a little behind, guys. Don't shoot the messenger. Well, since you didn't come up with the rules, Enhanced QC, I guess you're still all right. So okay, I think I'm following along where authentication there versus knowledge of that this is the same. And when we're talking knowledge of two things being the same, such as I'm going to download this file, I want to make sure that it's the same file that you expected that you uploaded. And when you provide a hash, that hash could still be MD5. A lot of systems still use MD5 CRCs for those sorts of check files. It is a very fast hashing algorithm, and collision isn't necessarily a huge problem in a lot of cases. But I don't know. I still would feel more comfortable with at least a SHA-256, SHA-512, knowing that it is slower, a little bit slower, or SHA-3, knowing that it is a little bit slower, but not much slower, and that there's much smaller likelihood of collision. Lysanki is right to have his eyebrow raised. I did the same thing. I said, what? They're still using MD5? Turns out, yeah, it's the only thing that has made it through the entire system. It made it through, wild guess, it made it through in the 1990s. And everybody said, works well enough. And the process of getting something new through takes a decade or two.
1992.
1992, okay.
They replaced MD4.
Well, that was when MD5 came out, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah. So making it through the judicial system and being eligible to be presented as a piece of information, that probably took several years afterwards. Eligible is a great term. All right. So, Mike, you had some thoughts on Azure Cycle Cloud.
Oh, me?
Yeah, by the way, is something else that until he mentioned it pre-stream, I didn't know about. So this is going to be another thing where I'm just going to pretend I know something, but I really don't.
Oh, no, I apologize. I was asking if you or any of the audience knew about it. I've learned about it today myself.
Yeah, so for folks in the audience who are not aware of this, Cycle Cloud is billed as high performance computing in clusters and being able to scale up and scale down based on need. So there is a pretty nice overview article of Cycle Cloud, and I'm pasting the link right here of why people might want to use it. Now, the one problem I had with this article is the very first phrase that caught my eye as I was scanning through this was on-premise. And so they didn't use the correct term on-premises, which, considering that this is talking about, cloud, where it's cloud and on-premises, I would have hoped that they would have gotten that bit right. So that may color the entire rest of the article's quality as a result in my mind. Unfairly, of course, but that is how that is how that works most of the time, unfairly. Nonetheless, what it is, the ability to, well, script out a concept of I'm going to perform some work and I need a lot of compute effort for this. And then, and by the way, this compute effort is going to be things like virtual machines and scale sets. So this is not an Azure Databricks cluster where I scale up the number of worker nodes and scale it down. This is more of maybe I need hundreds or thousands of machines for testing. Getting back to testing from earlier, I'm doing a massive retesting of the entire software suite, and I'm going to need to spin up hundreds of machines to kick off all of these automated tests, run through them, and when I'm done, I only need a few machines left over for regular testing that happens on check-in. And that's the type of thing that you could use for Cycle Cloud. Now, there is no job scheduling within it. So, bad news, Solomon, we're back to JCL. But it is not a scheduler, but it is instead more of a platform that lets you scale up and scale down on demand as you schedule it. So, you might have an elastic job, or you might use some third-party scheduler that will allow for the expansion and contraction of resources. Can you explain the distinction? So, Mike, do you mean the distinction on-premise versus on-premises? Because a premise is quite different from your premises. Premises being location, home. Yeah, just word usage typo. Yeah, it is a typo. But the premise that they lay out is that you should not be on premises. And on their premise, I don't know about that. But most people just say on-prem. Yes, that's because most people don't actually know which word is correct. And so on-prem is the safe term because on-prem is on-premises, which is the correct one. But a lot of people just don't recognize that on-premises with plural is the correct form of it. Don't know or don't care. I mean, yeah, that's also a factor. People's lack of caring, I would never discount. I never discount the apathy of others. Or the apathy of myself, for that matter. That's your word of wisdom for today. Never discount the apathy of others. I'd give you a second word, but I just didn't care.
That helps me. I'm getting learning in this new team. Remember, that's a new tool that I had not heard of, and we're using Slurm as a scheduler, and it is to plan work so that it can scale up and scale down. I think that the use cases they have a lot of compute, but they're not fully utilizing it. So they want to be better about managing it, and so they can scale down to one node out of 60. To save resources if it's not being used. And apparently this Cycle Cloud is the best way for them to do that.
It is a pretty solid way to do it if you're talking about especially things like virtual machines. So this is quite a bit different from platform as a service offerings where scale up and scale down is essentially drag a slider along and that's your scale up. Or make an API call with a new number. I now need 18 worker nodes. Okay, I need 6 now. This is trying to get to something like that, but for infrastructure as a service. Scrum, Sprint, the Agile? No, Enhanced QC. That too many of those words indicated to me that I should say no. So that's my answer. That's where one of these days, I'm going to lay out a hot take about agile software not really being agile, Scrum not really working well, and sprints as a perfectly bad metaphor for how awful software development methods are. Where, I mean, the sprint actually is a really good metaphor. It's just a really good metaphor for a terrible idea. Because you basically have, okay, go sprint for 3 weeks, and then go sprint for 3 more weeks, and then go sprint for 3 more weeks. And when you get to it, if you try actually sprinting and then immediately sprinting again, yeah, your sprints start to suck, just like in real life and just like in programming. Premises versus premisi. I hate you, Solomon, with the burning feeling of 1,000 suns right now.
Actually, on that point today, somebody in one of our developer groups sent out a link to this. I'll send out a link to Software Engineering's Greatest Hits, and it's a gentleman named Greg Wilson, and it's a about 30-minute presentation on kind of critiquing and using academic research to look into the way software is developed and like what are the most common mistakes people make over and over again and why they do that. It was really good. I'll send it in the chat right here.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty interesting talk. I mean, there's a lot in software engineering where, kind of going back to, we're a bunch of lazy people, so we're not going to follow strict engineering practices. But I think there's also a lot where people who are engineers in other fields, like mechanical engineers or people in those fields where engineer, I think more appropriately labels the job, look at the huge deficit of practice and procedure in software development and say that's not really engineering. And so you get to where, you know, my joke of, I know that my software is complete when I've hit 300 bugs because that means I've got enough to release it. That's kind of where you get to with software development of it builds, ship it. It's good enough. We'll fix it in post-production along those lines. And there are practices that can formalize things. I mean, we've known about the practices, but the problem is that the cost of implementing those practices is rather high. This is where you'll have some formal methods where in certain fields of software development, there is extreme care taken in lines of code written, because if I write this line of code incorrectly, people literally die. So this thing must work. And you talk about some code in military contracts. So that kind of stuff where I can't have this thing not work. It must work. It must work under extreme circumstances. Like, it's a rainy day, so the plane doesn't take off anymore. Not gonna work so well. Stealth fighters excluded. But when it gets to it, Scrum and Agile are just human protocols we had to create for devs to interact with other people. We had to turn being a human into a protocol for it to be adopted.
Ha, that's well said.
There is some of that in there, yeah. And to the extent that is why they're there, that's good to have. But I also think it's formalizing things that, some of it was sort of formalizing things that worked for me, and therefore they should work for you. So this practice worked for my group in this case, or the two groups that I've ever worked with, or things where the common denominator is I'm involved in this, and therefore it works. Sometimes practices are like, well, we created this thing and it failed, but you know what? I'm still gonna push it because I like it. Nobody actually does Scrum with the people who own the product, so it's almost always never agile.
That can be true.
Maybe that's
We
food for
generally do
thought.
use the owner, the product owner.
Almost every embedded system is life critical to some extent, at least their defense layer. Yes, but then, yeah, and I guess that might be where you draw a distinction between embedded systems and IoT, where the level of care and making sure that the thing actually works is significantly different. But on that pleasant note, let's wrap things up for tonight. So thank you everybody in chat for hanging out at the water cooler. When I think embedded systems, I think the NASA Mars rover. RIP rover. Well, one version of the rover. Now, the other rover, the one that's still hanging around, that's the positive side. Like, yeah, we've had the 14th failure of this thing, and it still keeps going because it turns out that there was another fallback option. So that's the positive side of things. That's where I'd love all code to be, but that's also a lot of pain and thought, and thinking is hard. And with that, let's stop thinking, wrap up the show tonight, and say thank you, everybody, and we'll catch you next time. Remember, tomorrow we do have the main meeting, SQL Server User Group main meeting. Chris Hyde is going to be talking to us about Azure Databricks. So come check that out, and we'll see you again soon.